I just thought this was the coolest thing in the whole world. And I was like, I'm going to go home and back to my air ambulance service in the southeast of England. And I'm going to, try and do some more new stuff, some cool stuff. So what I thought I'd do for the next 25 minutes or so is just summarize how I personally, and particularly our service, has changed our pre-hospital practice in the last 12 months and highlight some of the key areas on pre-hospital resuscitation and pre-hospital trauma management. And since I last saw you, we've got this, oops, it's gone. Can you resurrect the slide? Perfect, thanks. Got this super fancy new helicopter, and one of the reasons we've got this is we can actually do RSI in the back of the aircraft. Now, we've done this a few times on land. We've not yet done it in the air, but we have an SOP written. And I'm hopeful maybe next year to give you some data about what it's like to actually do your anesthetic whilst moving in the air. Now, for the next little while, we're going to focus on a key case. One case from my service. I want you to watch this video very carefully and think very carefully about how you as an individual are going to respond to this case. Okay? So here we go. It's a town near where you live. Boof. If you missed it, it's coming again. Okay, here's our patient lying on the floor. We very rarely get to see this. Okay, it's captured on CCTV. You arrive on scene, here's your patient. Okay, very classic. Blunt trauma. Blunt neurotrauma. He's got a head injury. One of the first things that happens is your ambulance crew very helpfully attach a monitor and up flashes some normal basic physiology. So look at the physiology. He's tachycardic, he's breathing fast, his first blood pressure reads 70/40. I'm not going to make you put up your hands. Who's going to give this patient a blood transfusion? Whole blood maybe after yesterday. Oh look, straight up at the back. He's getting whole blood. Brilliant. Love it. Okay, love it. Whole blood. Maybe a bit of fluid of some description. But here's the thing. This really changed my practice. This paper, actually from our service, published in Injury last year, that shows that patients who just have a brain injury can have profound abnormalities in their cardiovascular physiology. Actually, only about half of isolated TBI patients will have normal cardiovascular physiology. So if we look at this one and break it down a bit, you see there on the right, in 9% of patients who just have a TBI, nothing else wrong with them, they are not bleeding, they will have a pre-hospital heart rate of more than 100 and a systolic of less than 100 in almost 10% of the time. Now that's a bit of a, pardon the pun, a head fuck, isn't it? Okay? Most of you would have sat there saying that patient's bleeding and would have bet a lot of money and would have gone down that track. But actually, a big proportion of head injuries are vasoactive. Vasoactive traumatic brain injury is something I've learnt about. Okay, so say you decide, you know what, the numbers are pretty bad, I am going to give this patient something. Now we touched on this paper yesterday, but I think it's worth a quick revisit. The Pamper trial took patients with exactly this physiology, so blood pressure less than 90, heart rate more than 100, and randomized them to either have normal care, just whatever they normally had, or they got additional 2 units of pre-hospital plasma. And they used just normal plasma out a cool box. Now what they showed was pretty striking. With the addition of 2 units of plasma to your pre-hospital resuscitation strategy, there was a 10% reduction in your 30-day mortality. Now Charles showed the little diamonds yesterday, okay, the plot showing that plasma was significantly better than just standard care involving crystalloid. Now this is by no means the end of the story, and it's not the end of the story because if you look at some of the subgroup analysis, the 2 ones that struck out to me, patients did better when you gave them plasma when they just had a traumatic brain injury. What's going on there? Well, we don't really know, but there's actually quite good animal evidence to suggest that the plasma is quite good at reducing ICP. Probably better than things like mannitol and that kind of stuff in the pre-hospital setting. And even patients that aren't needing, the full-on transfusion, and we've had this experience, just by loading them up with some early plasma allows them to clot, allows them to achieve that hemostasis that you're trying to achieve. And in our service, we've certainly had some really good impact from lyophilized plasma. So it's a long half-life, a long storage life. You don't need to cool it. Very practical for use in the pre-hospital setting. So back to our patient who's been hit by the car. You've got your numbers. Let's say he's got a GCS of 5. Make it really easy, shall we? Who wants to RSI this guy? A few hands just itching, got to get the RSI. Okay, fine. And there's good evidence, isn't there, to RSI a traumatic brain injury. I love this slide. I always think if Carlsberg did pre-hospital RSI, it would look like this, wouldn't it? Why do we want to RSI our patient? We'd like to RSI our patient because it allows us to do all these standard things like give them lots of oxygen and control their end tidal, all the stuff you know. And this is lifted straight off our SOP in our service. This is why we do RSI for neurotrauma. Okay, so here's the next thing. One of the biggest meta-analyses of oxygen therapy versus normal therapy, so controlled oxygen versus liberal oxygen, published last year, and I would urge you to read it. A huge number of patients, over 25 trials. What was the headline? The headline was that when liberal oxygen was used, mortality was significantly worse. Conservative, controlled oxygen in any acute patient is much better than flooding them with oxygen. Again, we don't have time to go into reactive oxygen species and all this complex stuff, but the evidence is pretty strong that in-hospital mortality, 30-day mortality, long-term mortality was all better when you controlled your oxygen. And if you translate the statistics, this is a number needed to harm of about 71. It's quite striking. Think about your service. You probably have one of these. How many of these can you just ventilate someone on air? Probably not many. And actually, it's very difficult. We tend to just give our trauma patients 100% oxygen for quite a long time, and they might not need it. And if you don't have a ventilator, I'm sure many of you in the audience are sitting there saying, well, I don't have a ventilator, I just use these two. Maybe it's worth thinking about how we can control the oxygen we're giving. So having a targeted algorithm. So yes, sure, you're aiming for 96, 98%, but if you're achieving that, maybe then aim to start taking it down a notch and targeting your oxygen a bit better. So back to our SOP. My SOP says, in traumatic brain injury, for this patient, we should aim for a systolic blood pressure more than 90. I'm sure most of you will do the same. Aim for a radial pulse. Yeah, seems like a sensible solution. And I think Tim might have showed this a few days ago. This is the outcome from traumatic brain injury when compared to your lowest systolic blood pressure. And what do you notice? Well, there's no inflection point at 90. It doesn't suddenly get better. It's linear. In traumatic brain injury, in isolated traumatic brain injury, the higher your blood pressure pre-hospital, the better your outcome. So we should be striving for higher blood pressures than 90. We should probably be striving for as high as we can get. Okay, so again, something to think about. Now let's think about our patient. If the patient was the girl on the right, left, right, left, is it going to make a difference? Are you going to treat the 25-year-old hot fitness instructor the same as your 92-year-old granny if she gets knocked over. A lot of you are sitting there thinking, I'd never RSI that one, but I'd RSI this one. So I shouldn't be ageist, and I shouldn't be sexist. Let's make it a boy. This guy, he's pretty good at crashing cars, okay? My colleagues from east of England, with some of them here, imagine you got called to this guy, he crashed his car, he's GCS 4, he's 92. Are you going to RSI him? Karen roll. Because brilliant story on the news. You get knighted if you did. But actually, where's the evidence? We're all internally quite resistant to RSIing the 92-year-old, aren't we? Because we know the neurosurgeons are never going to take them to theatre. We think we know the outcome. Well, if you look at this study published last year, a single centre, but pretty large, so 1,300 patients over the age of 65, and almost half had a TBI. And most of those they got from just standing from falling height. And of course, some of them are on, anticoagulants and things. And about a third had neurosurgery. Okay, so pretty sporting. I would never persuade my neurosurgeons to intervene this often. Reasonable amount of intervention. But this was really striking. 78% survived their TBI, and nearly 60% went home, not just to a nursing home, but with a good Glasgow outcome score. So that means they went home to independent living, home to their families. So maybe we shouldn't be quite as ageist as we think. Actually, the patients in this age group with TBIs can and do very well if they have early neurosurgery. So let's change track just a little bit. Medical cardiac arrest, the bread and butter of pre-hospital medical care. All of you will be involved in out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. We've had great talks about it throughout the conference. But that one ongoing dilemma, to intubate or not to intubate. Just look at this conference. How many gadgets and gizmos and cameras and every cool little thing have we got to get an endotracheal tube into our patient's airway? And in cardiac arrest, the tube is the gold standard, isn't it? It's the Batman intervention. It secures the airway, it prevents aspiration, 100% oxygenation, and we arrive wielding our laryngoscope. We're all like that. And the supraglottic's just kind of second best, isn't it? It's like, the sidekick, right? It doesn't really save the day, it just helps the bigger guy. And we don't arrive wielding our iGel. It's just not as cool, is it? So actually in 2018, we had what we needed, a head-to-head. A Batman versus Robin, okay? A very clear, very elegant performed study in the UK, Airways 2, was a cluster randomized trial across 5 UK ambulance services, and they randomized medical cardiac arrest to a strategy that was either intubation first or supraglottic first, and a nice big number of patients, the biggest number of patients ever to be recruited to a trial like this. So what do you think the outcome was? Hey ho, no difference, okay? No difference in modified Rankin scale. So again, discharge alive with good neurological function, no difference whatsoever between your endotracheal intubation or your supraglottic airway. But here's the thing, let's just have a look, and all the usual health warnings about subgroup analysis, but when you went head to head, ventilation was achieved faster and in more cases in the supraglottic group than it was in the intubation group. Regurgitation, the big one. There was no difference whatsoever in the incidence of aspiration, regurgitation in either group. iGels were no worse at protecting your lungs from aspiration than the tube was. If you looked at ROSC, actually, there was a slightly higher incidence of ROSC in the supraglottic device. And that may be because, of course, with the supraglottic, you're just off the, you're on the chest more, there's less distraction, it's easier to do, And as we've heard yesterday, the CPR and the defibrillation are more likely to be formed to a higher quality. And that probably is summarized in this slide here. I know it's a bit busy, but what it essentially shows is some patients were randomized to get intubation. And for whatever reason, they actually ended up getting supraglottic first and then intubation later for, whatever situational reasons. And if you look at the different subgroups down here, the highest survival was in exactly that group. The group that got an early supraglottic, good resuscitation, and intubation later down the line. And actually, I've probably changed my practice as a result of this. I would probably intubate the patient after ROSC. Pre-ROSC, nice strong evidence to suggest that using the supraglottic is just as good. It allows good resuscitation. And then, of course, at some point, we're going to have to intubate them, because if they end up in intensive care, clearly they will end up intubated. But actually, the decision on timing, I think we can push the intubation to the right a little bit. Penetrating trauma, a biggie. Stabbing, shooting. My colleagues in London tell me almost 1 in 2 of their missions now, unfortunately, is for stabbings. Ours is on the increase. I'm sure a lot of you in your services have worsening penetrating trauma rates. So what's new in penetrating trauma? Probably not a lot. You all know that scene time is everything. Pre-hospital scene time needs to be really, really short. Now this isn't new, but the number of patients in it is. This is a big retrospective analysis of penetrating trauma patients and looking at their outcome by how they got to hospital. Did they get chucked in a car and driven there, or did they wait until EMS arrived and put them in an ambulance and then carted them off to hospital? And what you see is a very, very strong sign that actually the private transport ones did a lot better. Now we could think of all sorts of interesting reasons why, but this is a real case from the UK that really got me thinking. In the UK, when someone's stabbed or shot, the first person to arrive is usually one of these badass guys. Now these guys are pretty cool. They're calm under pressure. A lot of them have got military training. They've all got pretty advanced medical training. They can put a tourniquet on, they carry hemostatic agents, and they regularly deal with this kind of stuff. And we had a case in the UK not so long ago where a patient had been stabbed. The armed police had secured the scene. They said, we need an ambulance. An ambulance is coming. It's just coming. It's got to get through the cordon. It's got to find the scene. The police officer quite correctly recognized the patient was deteriorating in front of him. The ambulance arrived. It was an ambulance car, as we often send in the UK. Oh, sorry, don't worry, the ambulance is coming. 2 minutes, 3 minutes, another car arrives. And somewhere this sort of lost in translation. We need an ambulance, not an ambulance car. In the 20 to 25 so minutes, the patient continued to deteriorate. This patient was about a 7-minute drive from a major trauma center. And actually, the police officer could have put the patient in the back of his Land Rover. Okay, might have made a bit of a mess of the seat, but hey-ho. Spoken to the MTC and said, I'm coming in. He's got a tourniquet on. I'll be there in 7 minutes. Because I challenge you, actually think by the time the ambulance gets there and assesses the patient and does all the stuff we normally like to do, we're not going to compete with 7 minutes, are we? Should we just be encouraging these guys to just put them in the car and just go to hospital? Maybe think about that for your service. And could they have a link to your hospital where we could discuss this in real time with the trauma team leader? So just to wrap up then, what else did I learn in 2018? I learned probably one of the most valuable lessons I've learned in my pre-hospital career. The picture here was taken about 2 minutes before I completely fuck up this intubation. I've done loads of these and I look down, I can't see anything. I max out, it's all going a bit wrong. And actually the paramedic on the right is the guy that bailed me out, and he puts his hand on my shoulder and he calms me down, and it all ends fine. And this quote, I think, is probably true to all of you here. The road to self-insight runs through others. When you're stressed, when you're maxed out, of course you lose the ability to start self-critiquing. Paramedics, doctors, nurses see you at your most stressed in the pre-hospital environment. They can tell you how you perform under pressure. They're the ones that are going to tell you how you can get better, how you can do a better job next time. So I'd encourage you all to think about that. How can you in your service maximize the self-reflection by asking others around you how you performed? Now, no other means is as powerful as watching yourself on video. There's different ways we can sort of take command at scene. Here's an example.
No, just leave the head blocks, sorry. Just leave the head blocks. Okay, everybody, listen up, okay? I appreciate all your suggestions, okay? But we need one person in control, and it's going to be myself.
Awesome, isn't it? There's going to be one person in charge, and it's me. All right, now, Al had very good reasons for doing that, all right? But how do we reflect on it? Well, we regularly now use a body cam, a secure body cam, to look at footage, sit after a mission, and review yourself. How did you speak to the paramedic? Did you look them in the eye? How did you speak to the patient? How did you command the scene? Huge amount of information to be gained through video. And we're taking this one step further. Because, of course, at the moment, when we get a 112 or a 999 call, we're reliant on that bystander going right back to our first case at the beginning. Is he conscious? Is he breathing? These are very difficult questions for a bystander to answer. What happens if we could just see the patient? It's not that difficult. You all have video phones. You're sitting with them now. Why don't you just send a video to the ambulance control room? And this is exactly what we're doing using the Good Sam platform. So all we do is we send the caller a text message. They don't need an app. They don't need any software. Do they accept the text message? Yep. They hit the button, instantly start streaming the video to our control room. Now, not only that, the technology is, actually the beta version is so good that we can look and detect the patient's pulse rate down the video, all right? So as your blood is going around your face, there's a small amount of pixelation, the software can pick that up. How handy would that be, our guy that's been hit by the car right at the beginning, if we can just film him within 30 seconds, get his oxygen level, get his pulse rate, tell the bystander to open his airway. So hopefully next year I'll be able to give you some information on how this is going. We've just submitted a paper, or about to submit a paper shortly for publication on this, but it's very exciting technology. So ladies and gentlemen, in summary, what did I learn in 2018? Hopefully you now know what a vasoactive head injury is. Plasma pre-hospital, I think, is really useful and we should look at it. For your cardiac arrest patients, think about delaying your intubation until after ROSC. And when you do, control your oxygen. Don't give them too much. Titrate it. In your TBI patient, you need to aim for as high a MAP as possible. Don't be sexist. Don't be ageist. Treat everyone the same. Old people do well. And maybe after this conference, having heard all these awesome talks and met new friends and thought, what do other people do in their services? Just have a think about what you might do in 2019 to make yourself a bit better. Thanks very much for listening.
Okay, any questions for Richard? Questions? All right, in the back.
So what fluid did you give that patient?
So again,
What fluid did you give that patient?
it's a really good question. You know what I gave him? I gave him 4 units of blood and I gave him 4 units of plasma. And was I completely and utterly wrong? Yes. So we got to hospital, he had a normal lactate, he had an entirely normal pan scan, other than his head, of course. And that was a big eye-opener for me, because at the back of my head, the whole time I was saying, I think he's just a head injury, I think he's just a head injury, I think he's just a head injury. But I didn't have the balls, I didn't have the Caroline Leach balls of steel to say, he's just a head injury. And I think that's where we need to do a little bit more work. So we've recently introduced prehospital lactate, and I think that's where a normal lactate would have been quite helpful. If I'd have seen him with a normal lactate, it would have reassured me, and probably I would have held off a bit longer.
Right, we have two here first.
Two-part question. First is, do you guys carry pre-hospital ultrasound? And if so, would have taking a look at his IBC changed your management of giving him product in that case?
Yes, it's a good question. Yes, we do have pre-hospital ultrasound. We tend to just use it to predominantly for looking at pneumothoraces. I'm not an ultrasound buff. Probably I was not trained on it. My experience is, yeah, if you can get awesome like Tim Harris style pictures, then great. My experience is in these situations, getting good views, unless you're really, really good and doing it all the time, is quite challenging. I admit there may be a role for that, but in terms of trying to have a sort of universal SOP process across a system, it's hugely inter-operator dependent, so we don't do it for those reasons.
Hi, Richard.
Hey, Peter.
Thanks for your talk. One thing regarding the airways. If you look at the people getting the supraglottics, the ones that get to supraglottics may be a little bit more viable than the other, if you think. The ones that get intubated and you can't intubate them, or you have problems, or the ones that you can intubate and they are easily intubated, they tend to be maybe more dead. The supraglottics are easier to insert. Do you think that may be a confounder?
Yeah, so I think that, again, so the headline is, if you've not listened to it already, listen to Jonathan Benger's podcast. So Jonathan was the lead author on this trial, on the Resus Room. He does the best podcast on this, and clearly will explain it much better than I ever will. But you're absolutely right. The kind of, for example, the really short VFs that, get a quick shock and wake up again, well, they don't have time for any airway management, so there's a confounder in there. And of course, you're absolutely right. The kind of longer you go on and the more dead you become, the less airway tone you have, the more likely you may be to intubate. But I think they've, adjusted for some of these things, and I think the same message would still hold true, because actually, if you're sort of, you're trying to intubate early, they've still got the airway tone. It's not going to go well. The message to me is actually, and the other thing, of course, is, intubation requires skill, it requires training, and you need to keep that skill up. And actually, we're seeing it in our doctors now coming through. Actually, they're doing less intubations in hospital because supraglottics are being used. And the same is true for paramedics. How are you going to train your paramedics to maintain a high skill of intubation? And for that's a really big argument, I think, to use something that the skill maintenance is a lot less. But please listen to Jonathan's podcast. Thomas.
Yes, hi. Thank you, Richard, for a great talk. That was a great opening. But on the airways, is there anything in that trial on how they ventilate their patients? Because I'm worried about, especially with a tube, you can get higher pressures. If you ventilate quickly, that will affect the circulation. But is there anything in there on that?
The quick answer is no. So I think that is almost one of the next trials that needs to be came out. And it's very interesting speaking to Jonathan. They wanted to do a 3-arm trial of bag valve mask versus supraglottic versus intubation. So that would have been very interesting. But no, in the post-airway management phase, we're still in, and I think that is almost the next trial that needs to be done in terms of how do you ventilate them, with what, and then crucially with what, with what FiO2 should you use? Because we really don't know.
All right, thank you, Richard. Next speaker up is Hermann Brugger. And like always, there are some quick announcements. We found a key yesterday. Anybody missing a key? if you're missing a key, it's up here. Along with that earring that we found the other day. Still hasn't been claimed by anybody. There are some people who haven't paid for fondue yesterday, so if you feel guilty, please go up to the bar later and just do it now, today. And yeah, that's it. We'll have more info throughout the day.
Do we have a pointer? Okay. Okay, good morning, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for the kind invitation they have extended to me. I enjoyed the last 2 days so much, and I liked the combination between updating science and socializing on a such genius place like Zermatt. So it was really impressive, and I thank you again for this invitation. I live in also in a genius place. It's in the Dolomites, and that's also my working place since many, many years. I was in my life a GP and emergency physician out of hospital and in hospital in a smaller town. And in my leisure time, I had my activities in the mountains. And we do a lot of skiing there, off-piste, but also backcountry skiing, ski touring, and Coloas in the Dolomites, they are famous. They are so steep, but they are also very narrow, and they are rather safe, I would say. Not 100%, but they are safer than very broad areas where you have the possibility of a slab avalanche. And skiing down in powder is amazing. It's very attractive also for skiers on a piste to get off the pistes and to take quite a great risk sometimes. But on the other side, you can do ski touring not only here in the Alps, you can go everywhere in the world. You find your snow to ski up to here, for instance, 2 years ago in Tajikistan, where we went to the Pamir Mountains up to 6,200 meters. So in this case, you get hypoxic when you climb up, but you are quickly down and you are re-oxygenated very quickly within 10 minutes when you are down at 4,000 meters. So the oxygen molecules are flying. And this is what you feel literally. But there is in this sport activity one risk that can be fatal, and I show you how quickly this happens. This is it is a rather small avalanche, and you see it is not a question of minutes, but it's a question of 6 seconds in this case. That's what we are now talking about, avalanches in the next 25 minutes. And I would say cold. So cooling can be good in some cases, but not always. If we look at the statistics of the last decades, we can see that neither in North America nor in Europe the fatalities in numbers have any trend to increase or decrease, and this means that all the measures of prevention and treatment, education, information helped to keep the numbers as low as possible, because the number of exposed persons did increase enormously in the last 30 years, not only duplicated but now the number of ski tourers and off-piste skiers maybe is 10 times as high as 30 years ago. But what our interest from the research from the beginning was always what happens when you are caught by an avalanche. What are the decisive factors for a survival? If you see this lady, she's smiling. What was the decisive factor that she survived? Do you think it was the extent of burial, duration of burial, the depth, or that she had a patent airway? None of these? Who would like to opt for the last, that, or all of these? All of the four first questions, answers? Who would opt for the first, extent of burial? A few, but definitely this is the most decisive factor. Here you see the overall mortality of an avalanche burial is 22 in over 2,000 cases, 22%. But it depends on the grade of burial. If you are completely buried, so the mortality is more than 50%. If you are partially buried, that means that at least the head is out of the snow and you can breathe, then the mortality is quite low. It's less than 5%. This makes a big, big difference. So any measure that keeps you on the surface of an avalanche helps survive. And for instance, the avalanche airbag or other measures that are on the market. If you are not able to stay on the surface when the avalanche falls down, then it is the duration of burial, of a complete burial. And the first calculations of the survival curve using the so-called Turnbull algorithm with left censored and right censored data, I would not like to go into the details statistically, was published on Nature in the 1990s, but still now it is valid in most countries of the world. And you can clearly see there is a good chance of survival in the first 15, 18 minutes. So you have a short time span to find a survivor under the snow. But this is very, very short because you have to figure out where the person is buried. You have to dig out the person. So you lose a lot of time at the beginning of the rescue. After that survival phase, there is a steep drop in avalanche survival within a few minutes. And that's because most of the avalanche victims die from asphyxia, they die from suffocation, they cannot breathe, and the curve goes down very quickly to about 35%, from 92 to 35%. This is the tragedy. Here occurs the tragedy of most avalanche accidents. After that, you see there is a flat course of the curve. That means who is able to survive 35 minutes is able to survive for a longer term. 90, 100, 120 minutes doesn't happen very much under snow. This is a completely different population who survives. And that's possible because they are able to breathe. So they have an open airway and maybe a little air pocket, which is a little space in front of mouth and nose, no matter how small, but this helps to survive at least 2 hours. And then there is a small percentage of less than 10% that who survive for long term, more than 2-3 hours, and they have a connection to the outside. This survival curve is the same over the Alps. We compared Swiss data with Austrian data. There is no difference, and we compared European data from Switzerland with North American data with Canadian curves, and here you see a difference. The blue one is the Swiss curve, and the red one is the Canadian curve. And in Canada, the onset of asphyxia is much earlier than in Switzerland. So this was very surprising to us. Have you any idea why this can happen? Altitude could be, yes. And the snow, right. It is the snow quality, which is different in some areas of Canada. So very close, we separated we split the whole sample into 3 geographic areas. We saw that close to the Pacific, we have a steeper decline of the curve compared to the continental climate beyond the Rocky Mountains. And this makes the difference. Snow density was suspected to be the responsible factor. And another point was different. The long-term survival in Canada doesn't almost exist. Compared to Switzerland, you see there is a percentage difference of 9% between Switzerland and Canada. And this is probably due to a tighter network of rescue in the Alps. We have 5 minutes flight, 10 minutes flight from the center to the accident, whilst in Canada the flight durations are much longer. The geographic distribution of the rescue centers is much larger. It's much more difficult to get to the patient there, and there is no medical treatment or less medical treatment because most of the rescuers are rescuers. They have a BLS training, and this in comparison to Switzerland, for instance, here everybody is ALS trained. But this was an interesting finding that there is a long-term survival possible. It is possible to survive. How can avalanche victims survive for hours under snow? This was our research question. And we started with a very safe setting, experiments, field experiments, and we use this setting since many years. It is now recognized, it is well designed, and we use it all the time. It is safe, it is approved by ethical commissions, etc. And we can simulate avalanches very well. We throw down snow about 30-40 meters against a wall, and then we have a snowpack which is very similar to a real avalanche snow density, and then we make snow holes in this snow, like Jürg Schweitzer. He's the head of the Swiss Institute for Avalanche and Snow Research. And then we let the subjects, volunteering rescuers mostly, breathe from outside into these small caves with different snow conditions and the different dimensions of these caves. And we monitor all the data in a safe position. We started with the first studies about 15 years ago, and then we have seen what happens during breathing into these air caves. we have a very fast decrease of oxygen in the subjects and in the air pockets, and a concomitant increase of CO2 carbon dioxide due to the rebreathing of the exhaled air in the subjects and in the air pocket. So a combination of hypoxia and hypercapnia within a few minutes in all the subjects. And recently we looked at the snow density, and surprisingly we have seen that there is not a clear correlation between the snow density and hypoxia and hypercapnia. It is true that the denser the snow, the faster a subject goes into hypoxia, but at very low densities the subjects get hypercapnic as well. So we have a U shape of the curve of carbon dioxide, and we do not know the reason. Maybe it is a physical reason, a molecular reason, CO2 versus O2. CO2 is bigger than O2, and the crystalloid form of the snow when the snow is very fresh and a new snow with a low density. But this is interesting. It was not expected, surprising to us. So hypoxia and hypercapnia was quite clear that it happens very quickly. But what happens with hypothermia? And we knew from the literature that subjects who were buried for 60 minutes, 90 minutes, they were rescued in a hypothermic state. So with 30, 28, 26 or even less centigrades core temperature. And for this reason, because we knew that the decrease in temperature is accompanied also by a decrease of oxygen uptake, and this increases the brain hypoxia tolerance and the tolerance of low flow situations for many times, so everybody knows this. And therefore we planned an animal testing outdoor. It was in Austria, in a little village at the end of a valley, and we simulated again together with the Innsbruck Medical University, University of Tromsø was involved, Torkel Tveita, the Charité in Berlin, and the Mayo Clinic in the US. We simulated again the same avalanche, improvised an operation theater with a rescue team, and we buried pigs under snow, and we monitored invasively all the parameters we could measure. But this lasted a few days, and then, not surprisingly, now we know it, we were attacked by animal rights activists very, very aggressively. We got 33,000 emails from around the globe within 48 hours. And there was a bomb threat in the village. The village had to be evacuated. The whole valley had to be blocked for those people who came from Vienna and from Innsbruck. And the fourth or fifth day of experiment, we had to stop, and we concluded. But this changed our life, because we were, they followed us for many years, and I was quite really anxious a couple of years after that. So we would not do this anymore. We had a chance to publish this on Nature, on the other side, and in the British Medical Journal. And we got some good results from the first 9 tests we were able to conclude. And we have seen that, as expected, there is a fast drop in the core temperature in all buried animals, and a significant increase in serum potassium in those pigs that could not breathe. So this was very indicative for future also recommendations. More or less at the same time happened an accident close to my hospital, and it was also a small avalanche, a slab avalanche as you see, but this small amount of snow was able to cover 2 persons with a snowpack of 3-4 meters height, and the rescue personnel was quickly there, but after 1.5 hours, 100 minutes, they were able to extricate 1 person, and this person was under 3 meters snow. The air pocket was described, very well described by the rescuer. It was a small airspace in front of mouth and nose. The patient was unresponsive but spontaneously breathing, had a pulse, and the core temperature was 22, so extremely low. He was intubated, extremely well insulated. As you see, only the face is free. So this is state of the art for the rescuers today. And he was lifted into the helicopter, and just when he was in the cabin, he went into cardiac arrest with ventricular fibrillation. And the emergency physician on the scene in the helicopter was desperate. He knew the temperature, he knew 3 meters depth, 1.5 hours of burial, and he gave up hope. So he did not do anything. During the flight to the next hospital, it is our hospital, landed there on the roof. There was a very active second emergency physician on duty. He went up, he ran up to the roof, took a blood sample, took the serum potassium, and this was normal, 4.3. And this was the point to decide, now we start CPR and bring this patient to the next ECMO hospital. It was not ECMO, it was a cardiopulmonary bypass. And they brought the patient here from the accident site to the little hospital and to the university hospital to Innsbruck. And there the patient was resuscitated, rewarmed with cardiopulmonary bypass from 22, 24 at arrival to 34 centigrade, successfully defibrillated. And here you see the transceiver. So to locate, he was never switched on, and this was never switched on, the device. And he went then, after 2 weeks of hospital stay, he went home. No psychiatric treatment. He was sent to a psychiatry, but he did not accept. He said, my mother does it much better to prevent a post-traumatic stress syndrome. Okay, so this was this guy. I did some ski touring a year after the winter season, after when it happened, and he passed the exam as a park ranger 1 month after the accident. So he had certainly CPC1. Okay, this was one supportive case. And then we did an analysis in Austria to show that the air pocket, the presence of an air pocket and free airway has really a big impact on survival, especially if the duration of burial is longer than 15 minutes. Then we have a difference between 4 and 67% of survival in the presence or without a survivor. So in the end, we are very quite sure that a long-term survival is possible if the victim is able to breathe under snow. But what's reality? The most recent outcome studies in a selected sample, because they included only avalanche victims with cardiac arrest who arrived at hospital and were resuscitated and rewarmed with extracorporeal circulation. The survival of all 3 studies is quite low. In Austria it's 7, in Norway it's 0, in France 16%, but the numbers are very, very low. So overall survival rate of 12 compared to a survival rate in all-cause hypothermia of 50 up to 100% in some studies, like Vancher in Copenhagen. This was published in a review we published a few years ago. So it is much lower, the survival rate is much lower than compared to patients who are exposed to cold and are accidentally hypothermic. So all the recommendations published so far have one big question, because we have to select those patients who have a chance of survival, who can breathe under snow, and this is a very, very small ratio. So when shall we start with cardiopulmonary resuscitation at the site of the accident, and which patients should be transported to extracorporeal rewarming? This is the main question. We were invited by Anatoly Truchlar and by the ERC in 2010 and 2015 to collaborate together with Peter Pahl to collaborate in the establishment of recommendations for avalanches and accidental hypothermia. And the rationale was one study, a systematic review I did with Jeff Boyd. Jeff Boyd is a mountain guide. He worked in Banff in Canada. At the same time, he was an emergency physician. He's an excellent climber. Here we climbed together in Croatia. And we checked for the literature for prognostic factors and defined and figured out that airway patency, duration of airway, core temperature, and serum potassium are the most important factors, prognostic factors for survival in an avalanche situation. And the current guidelines, they are based on the fact that there is no successful rewarming, ECLS rewarming, from a temperature which is above 30 centigrades, core temperature, and this temperature can be reached at the earliest after 60 minutes, considering the fastest cooling rate in literature, which was 9 centigrades per hour. So this was the calculation. And the highest survived serum potassium level, Venus level, was 6.4, so very, very low compared to the 11.8 in accidental hypothermia. So the cutoff points we have proposed 2015 were 60 minutes for the duration of burial, 30 centigrades for the core temperature, and 8 millimole per liter for serum potassium. And with these cutoffs, we created the algorithm, which is quite simple, and it's published on resuscitation. And we separate two strategies. If the duration of burial is shorter or equals 60 minutes, then we should be as fast as possible, and we do normal ALS as usual. No difference to another patient in emergency medicine. If the time exceeds 60 minutes or the core temperature is lower than 30 centigrades, then it depends. Then we have to decide. We have to go through this algorithm. If there are signs of life, we try to bring the patient to a hospital which is capable of external active rewarming using forced warmed air, for instance, which is very safe and fast. If there are no signs of life, we should look at the monitor, and only if there is a flatline asystole and there is no patent airway, asystole plus blocked airway, then we can consider termination of CPR. In all other cases, if there is any electrical activity visible, or we are uncertain about the status of the airway and the presence of an air pocket, then we should consider bringing this patient to a hospital with ECLS. And we encourage emergency physicians to do this. And then at a second point, the serum potassium can play a role. If it is higher than 8, the chance of survival is extremely low, and it is justified to terminate resuscitation procedures. Okay, so this is the final result of our research. In short messages, I would like to repeat this. So if the cardiac arrest happens in a buried person with the burial time less or equal 60 minutes, then we have no hypothermic cardiac arrest. Cardiac arrest was normothermic, and it has the same chances of survival as a person with a primary cardiac arrest. If the cardiac arrest is in a person which was buried longer than 60 minutes and the airway is free, then we have a suspected hypothermic cardiac arrest, and we should start CPR continuously, or from new data we can also do intermittent CPR, so break the CPR shortly during terrestrial transport, for instance, if we are not able to continuously perform continuous CPR. And we transport this patient to the clinic with ECLS. How difficult all these can be, you can see in this video. So after this time, about 1 hour of burial, snow is hard like concrete. And the workload for the rescuers is enormous. The depth of a victim can be 2 meters, 3 meters, 5 meters. And the access to the patient is as narrow, as tight as in a car with an entrapped patient in a vehicle.
Ja, kleine Schaufel, eine kleine Schaufel, ohne mit der kleinen Schaufel. Ja, Puls, Schaufler, Schaufler.
So you always need the help of the rescuers. If the emergency physician would be alone, no chance of a rescue. And then we try to bring out the patient without great movements, not to mix peripheral blood with central blood, and to have a very a significant afterdrop after the rescue, and a perirescual collapse, which can happen and happens very frequently. And then we should start, if there is a cardiac arrest, with mechanical chest compressions. So in contrast to the outcome studies, I would say there are some cases where we need mechanical chest compressions anyway, because we have very long CPR times. And CPR times in hypothermia can reach 8 hours or approximately 9 hours, as we have shown in a case 2 weeks ago, published in the Annals of Emergency Medicine, where on the south face of the Marmolada, a climbing team was surprised by a snowstorm, and he went into hypothermia extremely quickly by the water coming down from the south face. He was picked up from the face by a long line helicopter action, and they quickly started CPR. Brought him, because the weather was bad then. The helicopter could not fly to the ECLS center. Had to be transported by ambulance. It lasted altogether 9 hours until the patient was rewarmed, and he survived without any neurological sequelae. So this is impressive. The times are so long, so you need a chest compression device. And only in the case where you have an ECG with an asystole and the burial time exceeds 60 minutes and the airway is blocked, in this case, no chance of survival. And these patients can be, the CPR can be terminated safely, and also safe for the rest of the rescue team at the scene. So altogether, the principle would be no hypothermic avalanche victim with a patent airway is dead until rewarmed and dead. So this is more or less the state of the science at the moment, and where should we go in the future? Can we improve? I liked so much the rescue chain with the little links on the right side. We are the smallest links of the rescue chain, as Charles has shown very impressively, and that's completely true. We should put our interest to the very beginning of the disaster. To make sure that the right information reaches the right person, we invented a checklist which accompanies the patient from the accident to the ECLS center. We installed an international avalanche registry. Mathieu Pasquier and his colleagues, they established a hope score for the selection of patients who are survivable in accidental hypothermia and cardiac arrest patients. And we are doing the same for avalanches right now. It is in a state of publication on resuscitation right now. So these are the developments, but we have a lot of limitations. And we fight against small sample sizes. This is especially true for hypothermia. And here you see the comparison. For instance, Nielsen, yesterday, thank you for this nice talk, had a yearly incidence of almost 500 patients per year. And we are almost neglectable. So with 1, 2, 3, 4 cases per year of hypothermic cardiac arrest in all those 3 studies, and these are the biggest retrospective observational studies. So we are really experts in small sample research. And not only that, we have a lot of confounders when we do field experiments. Extreme ambient temperatures, low barometric pressures, variable humidity, problems with the instruments, problems with the monitors, precipitations, UV radiations. So there are so many confounders and disturbing factors that are really, we have a problem with the reproducibility of science, which has been addressed a few months ago by both leading journals, Nature and Science, and that's really true in medicine in general, but especially in such niche areas like emergency medicine in mountain and remote areas. And I would remind on the statement of Karl Popper, 1934, the non-reproducible single occurrences are of no significance to science. So this is especially true for us, and that's why we have these problems in field studies. But there is a little hope. In Bolzano, I'm leading a research institute of mountain emergency medicine since 9 years. It is a research hub there. There's a big center for research, and we are going to open a climate chamber in a few months where we can simulate the climate of in all situations. We can go down with the temperature to -40 and up to +60 centigrades. We can drive down the atmospheric pressure to a simulated altitude of 9,000 meters, which is the peak of Everest. We can produce wind, rain, and snow, solar, radiation with a day-night cycle, so we can reproduce the global climate in a chamber which is big enough with 12 per 6 per 5 meters to host 15 persons for 45 days with all the services. So that means we can also test and monitor all the acclimatization processes. It is now finished. We started testing it, and on the 5th of April we will have a scientific opening with a conference, hopefully so successful like this one. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll have time for 2 questions, but we're a bit behind schedule, so I think that's it. I saw one there.
I have 2 questions. Firstly, what is the best method to measure the temperature out of hospital? And the second one, how did you define the limits of potassium? So 8 millimoles for avalanche and 12 for hypothermia.
Right, good questions. Thank you. And the first, the location where should we measure the core temperature out of hospital? This is a big issue, and at the moment we recommend to use esophageal site of temperature in the intubated patients, because it's quite easy to set the probe to the lower third of the esophagus if you have already the tube, and you can do this on the side, so visually. If the patient is responsive and not intubated, one can use the epitympanic thermometer. It is a thermistor, so it is a bimetal, and measures the temperature quite precisely. And if you insulate the ear channel, you get more or less reliable data, but with the risk that with a false low value, could be too low if it is very cold outside. So these are the 2 sites. We do not use the rectal bladder out of hospital, but esophageal for the intubated and the epitympanic for the non-intubated patient. And the second question, 8 versus 12. 8 for avalanche and 12 for accidental hypothermia. That's because there is one case of a child who survived with 11.8 serum potassium after exposure to cold. So 12 for hypothermia, accidental hypothermia without asphyxia. The risk of asphyxia seems to be a very, very safe limit. 8 is for avalanches. In avalanche we have a different situation because asphyxia is the main factor. And in asphyxia, serum potassium is the most reliable indicator, prognostic indicator. So we can lower the threshold because the highest survived measured level was 6.4, and that nobody survived a higher potassium level. But now we are calculating, we are using also new models, statistical models, to determine a safe threshold for serum potassium, and maybe I can tell you right now that it will be even lower than 8. So for the avalanche it is safe as well.
I have a question about prevention. Will my 1,200 Swiss franc avalanche airbag help this situation?
Yes, it's a good investment, I say.
Thank you.
Keeps you on the surface, but nevertheless, if you are not on the top of the avalanche, but on the bottom of the avalanche, and you are caught by the avalanche that comes from above, the airbag doesn't help. So you need a flow with the avalanche to keep you on the surface, because it's not the lower density, or it's not a swimming of the subject on the surface, it's the so-called inverse segregation. It's a bit difficult to explain. It's a physical phenomenon that if you have a bigger granula and you shatter, for instance, sugar, the bigger granula slowly come up to the surface, and this is the mechanism it works. So you need a certain distance, or you have to flow with the avalanche down from the mountain for a certain distance.
One just technical question. You talk about airway blocked or air pocket. If you say what would be an air pocket? Just a little bit of clear face, or like actually a pocket around the person?
A tricky point, because the definition of an airway is any space in front of mouth and nose with an open airway. That's the definition of an air pocket. We reduced this to airway because air pocket is a term which is not used in emergency medicine. So it's completely new, and it is strange for most of the readers. And so we reduced it to airway. If the airway is free, then plus minus air pocket, we say we should resuscitate anyway. But if there is an air pocket, it's a very positive sign for survival.
Okay, thank you. Great lecture. So we'll have a 15-minute break and then keep going.